Greetings, it's Artie from Artifact Electronics. So I was looking around my boxes the other day and I found that I still had some Atari Pinball CPU boards that I guess I looked at several months ago, and they were not working correctly, but I just put a few brief notes on them and put them aside. So I figured this episode we'll have a look at one of them, see if we can bring him back to life. The notes for this one kind of said CPU runs, but there's no I/O. i.e., it looks like all of the signals, the CPU is running, the reset signal's good, but there's no output to the lights, to the bulbs, and the output to the displays doesn't look too good either. And there was another note that I actually ran it, and it came up, but there was no attract mode. The lights weren't going in it. The lights weren't working at all. The display was showing garbage. So let's have a look at this guy. Let's verify that the CPU is actually running and take it from there. So I hooked it up to the bench supply, and when I enable the supply, it shows the board drawing about 2.6 amps, which is in line with the other boards, functioning boards. So the first thing is, let's check some of the signals on the CPU. I did have a note that said that the address and data bus lines were showing activity, but so I'm mostly interested in the control lines right now. The first one, the most important one, is the reset line, which is pin 40. And pin 40 is high, and that's good. That means the reset signal is inactive. If I press the reset button, it goes low and comes up. What you see on a lot of these boards is because they have a watchdog, and if the watchdog doesn't get its bone periodically, it'll toggle the reset line. And that's if the board goes bad, they don't want it sitting there with a gazillion solenoids pulled in and burning up the machine and all that. So what you see a lot of times is on this pin, basically the signal is oscillating very slowly, which means it resets, it doesn't get its bone, or the processor doesn't reset the counters. The counters go on counting and eventually reset. But this one has a stable reset signal, so that's not the problem here. To check some control lines, let's see. Pin 1 is ground. Pin 2 is the halt signal, and that's pulsing. What the halt signal does, it's like on a Z80, it's called bus request, and what that really means is normally the CPU owns the bus, owns all the data lines, address lines, control line outputs, and all of that. But sometimes you may want to gain access to the bus with external circuitry, and on the 6800, it's just called halt. It's normally high, it's active low, and we can see that somebody keeps pulling the halt line low, and that's actually good. That's the way it's supposed to be. And the halt line is not an instantaneous thing. When the halt line is asserted on the processor, it will finish what it's currently doing, finishing an interrupt cycle or instruction execution, and will then signal that it's ready to give up the bus. That is the bus available signal, which is pin 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we see that that's also happily pulsing, which means it's receiving the halt signal and it's satisfying it, meaning it's giving up the bus. And what that means is it's basically tri-stating all the address and data lines, and most of the control output lines also, enabling anybody else on this board to gain access to the bus. And what's the reason for that? The reason for that is that on this board, lamp data, display data is not written directly to the device, but rather written into RAM by the processor, these two RAMs over here, and then there is hardwired circuitry on here that starts a DMA cycle periodically. And the DMA cycle addresses, does a bus request or a halt request on the processor, and when the processor gives up the bus, it puts up address and control lines on the bus and transfers the data from RAM into the output circuitry for the lamps and the display. Now, if we look at the display, at this carries the display signals. This is the actual DMA signal, and that looks good. But any of the other signals are there, but the displays are still showing garbage, which means there's activity on these signals, but they are not doing what they're supposed to. Now, if we look at the lamp outputs over here, these should be pulsing, because when they go low, the lamp lights up. The lamps basically have a common power bus, and the other end of each lamp is hooked up to one of these pins. When this goes low, the lamp lights up. But we can see these are floating. And that's normal because they're driven by these drivers over here, which basically, when not enabled, are floating. The output's floating, and that means the lamp isn't getting any juice. But when one of these drivers gets enabled, the corresponding output goes low, providing the lamp with a solid ground, and it lights up. But there's nothing happening. These should all be pulsing over here because the device is sitting in a track mode right now, and the lamps are doing all sorts of nice things, but they're not. So my suspicion goes towards the DMA circuitry that picks up, and let's concentrate on lamps for just now, that picks up the lamp data out of the RAMs, gates it through the demuxes and the drivers, the open collector drivers, and drives the lamps. And that isn't working correctly. So let's look at the DMA. So remember, when the processor is halted, it's not generating any addresses or data, but rather an external source has to generate those. And here's part of the DMA circuitry. There's some counters here that generate addresses. The RAM addresses from where the data should be transferred to the lamp drivers. And we can see they're isolated from the address bus and data bus by these three-state buffers here. And we can see that the buffers only get enabled when the bus available signal is active, here and here. So something's generating all these signals here. There's counters running, no processor required. And when the bus is available, they feed certain address lines, the read-write signal, which, if you look at it, the read-write signal is tied to a pull-up, which means when DMA is in control, it can never write to the RAM, but rather always reads the RAM. You don't want DMA writing to RAM. That's not implemented here. All we need to do is read the values in there. So the one thing I figured on checking next is to see if the DMA addresses are getting generated and look right. So let's get started over here with C4 and see what all the inputs over here, what they look like. So C4 is this guy with a boatload of sticker residue on it. Could that be a hint? Well, let's see. So pin 10 gets the DMA generated A address 0 line. And let's see, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I guess I better pull back. So on the probe it looks good. Address line 1 goes in on pin 6. Also looks good. Keep in mind that A0 should be running the fastest on pin 10. It's, you know, I mean, if you want to know exactly, you put it on a scope or frequency counter, but this is running at a certain speed. And then 6 is A1. You can kind of hear from the noise it makes that that's definitely running slower than A0. So that seems okay. Address 2 goes into pin 12. 9, 10, 11, 12. Address 3 goes into pin 4. Address 4 goes into pin 14. Guess what? That one's stuck low. So we found something, definitely. Pin 2 on here is address 5. That's also running. Alright. So where are these signals coming from? So these are generated by a counter, which is marked as a 9316, but actually on the board there's a 74161, which is the same thing. It's a binary counter, a fully presettable binary counter. Now the way the preset on this one isn't used, because you can see the preset inputs are all grounded. Well, that's not really true. I guess when you reset the counter and it's supposed to load the initial condition, it'll always reset to 0. But when it's running, it just counts up in binary, and it's driven by the DMA clock. So here are the output pins, 11, 12, 13, and 14, which generate A5, A4, A3, and A2, and then A1 and A0 come from another counter down here, and generated the counter from QB and QC over here. But remember, the deadline we saw came out of this guy up here. So let's have a look with the scope and see, is that line really dead? I mean, the logic probe is actually pretty good, because it will catch transitions that if your scope isn't set up correctly, you can actually miss on the scope. But the probe will happily flash and make noise and let you know that there is activity. It may be an extremely narrow pulse that, as I said, if the scope isn't set up correctly, you won't see. But this is the opposite now. It's telling us that there's a line that's dead. So what I'm suspecting is there may be something wrong with that chip. Now again, that's not 100% because the chip, it's driving other signals too. For instance, the bad output, QB pin 12, I think it was, is driving a bunch of other stuff. So there may be other stuff that went bad that is pulling that output low. But the easiest place to start is at this counter itself. So let's look at it. Look at the outputs with the scope. Alright, so let's probe the outputs from the 9316 or the 74161. And I'm gonna do it in the order that they appear on the schematic. Pin 11 is what generates DMA A5. So 8, 9, 10, 11. That looks good. Scale is 2 volts per division, so it's swinging pretty high. The next output, which is A4, comes out of pin 12, and as I'm probing it, that is in fact, that's stuck low. It ain't moving. There's nothing happening in here, so that output either is defective on that chip or is being pulled low. But okay, we found one bad part. Next is pin 13, which generates DMA address through A3. And look at that. It is pulsing. So the probe told us correctly that that output's pulsing, but it's barely making it to 1.5 volts. And only on one of the pulses. So that's bad, because that's not enough to drive anything properly. So 2 outputs are bad. And for completeness, we can look at the last one, which is, let's see, pin 14, which is DMA address A2. And that one actually looks right. You got little bunch of pulses clustered together, but they are making it high enough, and even though that looks a little bit suspicious too, because look, it's almost making it to 5 volts. Normally TTL outputs, because of diode drops in the transistors, they won't make it that high. So this, I think that the chip needs to be replaced. And we need to look at the guy. We've been through this drill before. Here he is. I'm not going to show this in detail, but in order to preserve the traces on the board, I'm just going to cut all the pins close to the chip, pull the chip body out. Sorry about that. Stay. What, now I need a new tripod too? Anyway. So this is the guy. We're going to cut the pins close to here, take the body off, and then pull all of the pins one by one by heating the pads, clean out the holes, socket it, and put a new chip in there. So as I'm waiting for the soldering iron to heat up, cut out the chip. Nothing surprising underneath, no secret maps, no anything, but I noticed something that looks suspiciously like a solder blob bridging these 2 lines, and this thing is stuck. I mean, it's on here. You know, it's not moving, so it's adhering to those traces. So let's see, is that actually a solder blob or a manufacturing defect, or what is that? Well, there's an easy way to find out, and that is does it come off. It sure does. There still looks like something. Oh, that's good. Wouldn't that be interesting? If that blob was basically shorting the two legs on the IC I just cut out, if it was shorting those two legs together. Well, let's clean this out, put a new chip in, and find out. But if I hadn't removed this and looked closely at the board, I would have never ever found that. And we'd be here, 3 days from today. Alright, it looks like that didn't work. Things changed, but now if we look at those pins from the counter coming out, 11 power would help. Is stuck low. 12 is stuck low. 13 and 14 work fine. So now there's a simple test to run here. I mean, this is a new chip. What I could do, since it's socketed, is take it out, bend the pins that are stuck low up, and then measure them. But this is a new chip. It is period correct, by the way. Let's see, can you see that from here? Has a date code of 79 on there. That's a new chip. It was unused, so having the exact same problem as the other one is not very likely. So what we're going to do is look at the schematics and see what those pins feed. And then find out what's pulling that down. So here's what we just replaced. And pin 11 and pin 12 are being pulled low. So let's see, this guy feeds A5 and then just a buffer generating the display address, and goes into B2, which generates A12. And the same thing, pin 12 comes down, feeds buffer A5 and gate B2. So the way we're going to test this is, well, it's coin toss. Is it this or is it this? The only thing common to the whole thing, well, actually common are both this guy and this guy, but this is the gate that's kind of using the two signals that went bad, and this is using a bunch of others. 4 used to be bad, that's good now. So it's almost like, yeah, this had at least one bad output, but there's something else downstream that caused that output to go bad. So let's do this. What I'm going to do is first cut pins 2 and 4 on C4 over here. Now the way I'm going to cut this is not, since I'm not yet planning on removing this, instead of cutting it close to the chip itself, to the body itself, I'm going to cut it really close to the pad. And the reason I'm doing that is I'll disconnect 2 and 14, but if it turns out that this is not the offender, I can simply bend the pin back down again and solder it back onto the onto the pad. And if that doesn't yield any results, then we'll do the same thing here. Oh, and of course here. So, you know, why don't I save time and throw the parts cannon at it? Because I'm kind of curious to see who the offender actually is. Now these are marked 8097s, which are also a little bit hard to come by. But it turns out that those are 74 367s, again exact replacement, of which I have a few. So let's go ahead and just go down the line, starting with C4. So we had a big fail because I cut every pin that was connected to pin 11 on the newly replaced chip, and it was still stuck low. So what I did was I took the two pins actually that are misbehaving or seem to be stuck low on the new chip and bent them up, disconnecting them from the net. And now, turning on the power, as you can hear, this came to life, that came to life, all of them are alive. But since I've cut all of the connections to what they were feeding, we must have a board error here somewhere. And now it gets a little painful because I got to start cutting traces and seeing where those traces are going awry. So I spent a fair amount of time trying to analyze, looking at the exposed traces at least, to see if they were shorting against anything, and I couldn't find anything wrong. So I figured, hey, let's start replacing parts, see what that does. I pulled a 367, which essentially gates the DMA address onto the bus when the processor's halted. And I took it out, and it looked like somebody had used the same approach as I just did in troubleshooting this, because they had, from the outside at least, cut pins and lifted them, it looked like, and then kind of figured, hey, that's not the problem, bent them back down and soldered them quite neatly from the outside. So I couldn't really see it. But once I removed the original pin, there was a couple of nasty solder splashes right underneath it. So when they soldered the pins back into place, they obviously damaged the board. Not damaged the board, but solder splashed it. And that's what was causing the problem. Or at least I'm hoping that's what was causing the problem, because I went ahead, I resoldered all the pins I had cut from stuff that was connected to those lines. As I was doing it, this SIP resistor array broke off. So I'm guessing that it was on its last leg, or legs literally. But even without this pull-up, it's not really necessary. It's a 10K pull-up, and it's being driven by a normal TTL drive, and that doesn't really need a pull-up. So that, I mean, they put it in for reliability, but even if that had been broken off, it wouldn't have caused the thing to malfunction. But I did replace it, removed a really mangled bypass capacitor from here, and so let's check the lines. Pins 11, 12, 13, and 14 on here, which generates the DMA, 4 DMA addresses. So 8, 9, 10, 11, which was stuck low, is now that's looking good. 12, 13, and 14. Looks like they're all working now. I hope I reconnected the pins I had cut properly, but the best way to bench check this is, first of all, let's see how the display lines look. And they all look good. Now remember, I have a bit of experience with these boards now. I've repaired several of them, and I have a pretty good idea, just looking at the logic probe, what these signals are supposed to look like. And those look pretty good. The next check is actually going to the connector that generates the light signals. And it looks like those came alive. And one way to further bench test this is I have an LED, one end tied to power, and the other end has a limiting resistor, and I'm just going to touch some of these edge connectors. And you can see that the lights are doing something. Now we won't know for sure, of course, until we test this inside a machine. But it looks like, at least with the lights and the display outputs, something is working. So let's give it the acid test. Well, ready for the big test. One more thing I did was, this is a board that was in the machine that was working. I didn't really trust those, and this is the repair board, I didn't really trust those ROMs. So what I did was I pulled the ROMs out of this board over here and plugged them in there. One less unknown. So I'm going to turn it on like this first in case something goes up in smoke. But let's see if at least we get some light action. And we do. Very cool. So let's bring down the play field, see if the displays are working, and if we can actually play a game on this. Okay, play field's down. Let's see. Power switch time. Ha! And the display came back. Very nice. So let me put the glass back on and see if she plays. Alright, here we go. Credits up. Close the coin door, which is being obstinate right now. Always does that when I try to put the lockdown bar in, but here we go. Well, It's alive. Alright, so we got another CPU board working, waiting for another Space Rider's carcass to show up, and then we can get that one alive. Closing words are, if I had just gone ahead and replaced every chip that looked suspicious, may have saved some time, but where's the fun in that? I want to know exactly what's going wrong, so the next time I pull out another board and I see similar symptoms to this, I'll know immediately what to test and what to look for. So I think it was worth the extra time to track down the actual problem rather than just replacing everything and then going, okay, it's fixed. I don't know exactly why it's fixed, but it's fixed. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Like and subscribe, and leave me a comment. We'll see you next time.